Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Black Sun by Graham Brown, narrated by Jeffrey Kafer. Prologue. Bering Sea, November 2012. The 50-foot trawler Orlovsky Star pushed on through the frigid Arctic waters and a lingering fog that seemed to have no end. The sea was unusually calm and the wind non-existent, but with the outside temperature dipping to 15 degrees Fahrenheit and the water holding just above the freezing point, the conditions were anything but benign. Alexander Petrov stood at the wheel inside the darkened pilot-house, a grim air surrounding him. His weathered face, shaved head, and clenched jaw all suggested a burden his broad shoulders were struggling to carry. He stared into the darkness ahead of the boat, listening to the thrum of the engine and the occasional muted thump of ice banging against the hull. So far, the ice had been thin, small free-floating chunks that his boat could slide through at half speed. But the pack ice formed quickly at this time of year, spreading south like a plague, and just an hour before there had been no ice at all. Guiding the boat on feel as much as sight, Petrov considered the danger. If the ship didn't reach warmer waters soon, they'd be trapped, and the thin hull ground into metal filings long before any rescuer could reach them. Then again, perhaps they deserved such a fate for what they were attempting to do. As another impact reverberated through the cabin, a voice spoke from behind him. "It's getting thicker. We need to make better speed." Petrov glanced into the recesses of the darkened pilot-house. A heavy-set man gazed back at him. This was Vasily, a Russian of mixed European and Asian descent, and the broker of their unholy deal, the keeper of their unusual human cargo. Despite the cold, Petrov could see a thin sheen of perspiration on Vasily's upper lip. If Petrov was right, Vasily's mind was reeling in a battle between greed and fear, between the possibilities of life-altering wealth just days away, and a horrible death in the crushing embrace of the ice. "What are you really worried about, Vasily?" "That we're lost," he said bluntly, glancing at an exposed circuit board and what had been their navigation system. The GPS receiver had shorted out 8 hours before, the screen flashing and the casing catching fire in a shower of sparks. Petrov had examined it briefly, but saw that it was clearly beyond repair. For an hour he'd used the stars to guide them, but the fog had thickened and he'd been forced to rely on the vessel's compass. "I was a fisherman before I joined the Navy. I learned to navigate at the hands of my father," Petrov assured him. "I know what I'm doing." Vasily stepped closer to him. "The crew is worried," he whispered. "They say our journey is cursed." "Cursed? Orcas followed us down the channel," Vasily explained, "and we've seen sharks every morning, far too many for such northern waters." That had seemed odd, Petrov thought, as if the predators of the sea were shadowing them, waiting for a meal to be delivered into their hungry bellies. But he hoped it was mere coincidence. "It's almost dawn," Petrov said, changing the subject. "We'll have a few hours of light, nothing more, but it should be enough. The fog will lift and we'll make better time." Petrov's statement was designed to ease Vasily's fears, but even as he spoke they found another mass of ice and a grinding resonance travel down the starboard side. From the sound alone they could tell it was thicker and heavier than those they had hit before. Petrov reduced the speed to 5 knots. This was the trap he'd been hoping to avoid, one he'd warned Vasily about. Thicker ice meant slower speed and thus more time for the ice to form in the waters ahead of them. He switched on the overhead lights, but the fog swallowed the beams and reflected the energy back, blinding him. He shut them off. "We need a spotter," he said. Before he could call the crew, the boat slammed something head-on. The nose of the boat pitched upward and their momentum died, as if they'd run aground. Petrov cut the throttle. In utter silence, he waited. Finally, the boat began to move, sliding backward a foot at a time, and then settling once again. He breathed a sigh of relief, but he dared not touch the throttles. "We cannot stop here," Vasily said. A crewman popped his head into the control room from the lower deck. "We're leaking, Captain," the man said. "Starboard, forward." "How bad?" Petrov asked him. "I think I can seal it," the crewman said. "But we don't want any more of that." "Wake the others," Petrov said. "Get them into their survival suits. Then do what you can." It was a precaution only, and also a bluff meant to calm the fears of the men. But even in their suits they would not last long in the water. He turned to Vasily. "Give me your key." "I don't think so," the broker replied. "So you will take him then?" Petrov asked. "If we have to leave the ship?" Vasily hesitated, then reached under his sweater and pulled out a key that dangled around his neck. Petrov snatched it and then pushed his way outside. The fog hung in the air, cutting at his face like shards of suspended glass. Not a breath of wind could be felt, and with the engines shut down, the silence was complete. He looked around. A thick layer of frost covered the deck, while daggers of ice hung from the bridge and the ladder and the rail. Every surface, every line, every inch of the vessel had become encrusted in ice. The ship looked dead already. Vasily came out a moment later, bundled from head to toe, but still too stupid to put a survival suit on. "Why did you stop?" "So we don't rip the boat apart." "But we can't stay here," Vasily replied. Of course they couldn't, but they could no longer risk moving in the dark. The fog made it impossible to see the danger, and impatience would destroy them. But to some extent they seemed to be in luck. The fog was beginning to lift. In addition, the thin light of the approaching dawn had begun to illuminate things. This far north, the sun would never get off the horizon, but the lights would grow quickly. Petrov hoped it would show them a way out. And yet, even then, something seemed wrong. The sky was darkest ahead of him. It should have been just the opposite. The brighter light should have been out in front of them. It had to be some illusion of the fog, but it seemed as if the sun were coming up in the wrong place. Before he could come to terms with this, something heavy bumped the boat and pushed it to the side. "What was that?" Vasily asked. The slight impact could have been an iceberg moving on the current, but as he looked over the side, Petrov saw that the waters remained dead calm. The ice wasn't moving. "Alexander," Vasily said. Petrov ignored him and moved toward the bow. The fog had thinned considerably. Replacing it was a sight Petrov could hardly fathom, a field of solid white. Unbroken ice that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "My God," he whispered. The ice was clearly impenetrable, but the truth was more damning than that. The sun had finally begun to peek its face over the horizon, not ahead of them and to the left as it should have been, but behind them and to the right. Even Vasily realized the mistake. "You've taken us the wrong way," he shouted. "We've been sailing to the north all night." Petrov reeled from the air. Relying on a magnetic compass was tricky around the poles, but he was no amateur. And yet somehow they'd spent hours tracking toward the danger, into the thickening ice pack instead of away from it. "How could this?" he began. "You goddamned fool!" Vasily cursed him. "You've driven us to hell!" Petrov's legs almost buckled from the realization, but urgency pushed him on. He glanced toward the stern. The ice there had not yet formed into a solid block. If they moved quickly, they might just survive. He brushed past Vasily, driving for the pilot-house. Before he could open the door, something slammed into the boat again, but this time the blow was sharp, a solid impact, rolling the boat 10 degrees or more. He shouted to his crew, "Reverse! Reverse! Get us the hell out of here!" The engines rumbled beneath the deck, and Star began to back up, but another impact shoved the bow to the right, crashing it into the ice floe. Yanking the door open, Petrov went for the wheel and pushed a crewman aside. His hand found the throttles and moved the engines from a quarter astern to half. "Something hit us!" the crewman shouted. "Ice moving on the currents," Petrov said, strangely certain that he was wrong. The impact had been powerful, deliberate, more like an intentional ramming. He began to think about the orcas and the sharks. Vasily stumbled back inside the bridge. "It could have been a submarine," he said. "Remember the FSB." Petrov thought of their cargo and the importance it was deemed to hold. Agents of the FSB, the Russian successor to the old KGB, had hunted them for weeks, trailing them across much of Siberian Russia. No doubt they were still looking. But a submarine? A ramming? Perhaps it made sense. Certainly they would not risk destroying the vessel with a torpedo. He spun the wheel, bringing the nose of the vessel around. After swinging through 90 degrees, he shoved the throttles forward. The boat began accelerating, bulling its way through the ice, pushing toward gaps of black sea, spots of open water where he could make better time. If they could just... Another impact caught the boat, jarring it to the right, lifting the bow and then dropping it. The hull couldn't take much more. Petrov gunned the throttles, grinding the metal hull and risking the props. "Captain, you have to slow down," the crewman said. "1 mile," he shouted back. "Then we'll slow." But even before he finished the words, a crushing impact hit on the port side. An alarm began ringing as water flooded in. "Get everyone topside!" Petrov yelled. The crewman shouted something back to him, but the alarm drowned it out. "Maybe we should make a distress call," Vasily said. Petrov glanced at him. "Too late now." A voice shouted from the deck. "Akula!" It was the Russian word for shark. Petrov glanced out the window and saw a dark shape slicing through the black water toward them. It hit them below the waterline, and Petrov was thrown to the floor by the impact. Another blow followed, stronger and heavier, multiple thuds, like fists pounding on a door. The sharks were slamming themselves into the hull, ramming it like living torpedoes, hitting the boat with such force that they had to be injuring themselves. "What the hell is happening?" Vasily yelled. Petrov could not fathom it. He had never heard of such a thing. It was as if some sort of madness had infected them. He glanced to starboard. They were about to hit the ice. "Hold on!" The ship slammed into the ice shelf, then recoiled from the impact. It rocked wickedly in one direction and then back in the other. For a brief instant it rolled to a level beam before beginning to list. "Abandon ship!" Petrov shouted. "Abandon ship!" The order was unnecessary. The men were already near the stern, readying the lifeboat. He counted 5 men there. Only Vasily and the crewman beside him were missing. And their passenger. "Go!" he shouted. "Go now!" As they pushed through the hatch, Petrov charged below deck. Dropping into the swirling water, his feet went instantly numb. He waded to a closed cabin door and pulled the key he'd taken from Vasily. He unlocked the door and forced it open. Inside, sitting cross-legged on a bunk, was a 12-year-old boy with a round face and dark hair. His features were indistinct. He could have been European, or Russian, or Asian. "Yuri!" Petrov shouted. "Come to me!" The boy ignored him, chanting and rocking back and forth. Petrov charged forward, lunging and grabbing the child off the bunk. He slung him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, and then turned toward the door, just as another impact rocked the boat. The Star groaned as it took on water. Petrov braced himself against the wall that now leaned at a 20-degree angle. Regaining his balance, he fought his way out into the hull. With Yuri clinging to his neck, Petrov fought against the rushing water and made it to the stairs. He clambered onto them, dragging himself and the child upward, pushing through the hatch as the boat passed 30 degrees. She would roll over at any second. He looked to the rear deck. The survival boat was gone, floating 30 yards from the foundering stern. But something was wrong. The men were in a panic, looking around, pointing to something. A shape erupted underneath them, a huge gray body with a triangular dorsal fin. The life raft flipped, sending the men flying into the sea. Dark tails slashed between the sheets of ice, cutting the surfaces like knives. Petrov heard the horrible sound of his men screaming. Akula, murdering his crew. He had never heard of such a thing. The Star tilted farther, and items came pouring out of open cabinets. He pulled himself through the doorway and stood on what had been the bridge's sidewall. It began dropping away beneath his feet. The ship was rolling. A rush of air came up through the water. He jumped. Landing hard on the pack ice, he tumbled. Yuri was flung free of his grasp, sliding and sprawling on the ice. A thunderous crash erupted behind him, and Petrov turned to see his boat plunging toward the depths of the sea. Pockets of air exploded as the vessel went down, concussions echoed through the frigid air, and waves of debris came rushing to the surface. And then it was quiet. Roiling black water, floating wreckage, and small chunks of ice swirled where the ship had been, but the noise of the struggle had ceased. He looked to the south. The survival boat was gone, and the only sign of the crew was a pair of empty life jackets. In places he saw the sharks crossing back and forth, searching for anything they might have missed. Only he and Yuri remained. Somehow they had landed on the edge of the ice pack. 3 feet thick and as hard as concrete, it might as well have been solid ground. He turned to look at the boy. Their cargo, paid for at a cost of $10 million, with the lives of his crew taken for interest. Did he even know what he was? What he could do? Did it even matter anymore? Already shivering, Petrov stood. He raised his eyes to what lay beyond them, a shelf of brilliant white, the barren wasteland of the ice pack, floating on the salt water of the sea. It was a continent in all but name, with only 2 citizens to inhabit it. And in all likelihood, they would be dead before the sun rose again. Chapter 1. Southern Mexico, December 2012. Danielle Laidlaw scrambled up the side of Mount Pulamundo, sliding on the loose shale and grabbing for purchase with her hands as much as her feet. The frenetic pace of the ascent, combined with the thin mountain air, had her legs aching and her lungs burning. But she could not afford to slow down. 34 years old, attractive and athletic, Danielle was a member of the National Research Institute, a strange hybrid of an organization, often considered a science-based version of the CIA. That they were currently searching for the truth behind an ancient Mayan legend seemed odd, but they had their reasons. The fact that another armed group was trying to stop them told Danielle that those reasons had leaked. She glanced back to one of the men climbing with her. 30 feet downslope, Professor Michael McCarter struggled. "Come on, Professor," she urged. "They're getting closer." Breathing heavily, he looked up at her. Imminent exhaustion seemed to prevent a reply, but he pushed forward with renewed determination. She turned to their guide, a 20-year-old Chiapas Indian named Oko. "How much farther?" "We must get over the top," he told her in heavily accented English. "It is on the other side." A few minutes later they crested the summit. McCarter fell to his hands and knees, and Danielle pulled a pair of binoculars from her pack. They stood on the rim of a volcanic crater. 1,000 feet below lay a mountain lake with a small cone-shaped island bursting upward at its center. The island's steep sides were thickly wooded, but unable to disguise its volcanic nature. Yellowish fog clung to it, drifting downwind from vents and cracks. "Is this it?" Oko nodded. "Isla Cubierta," he said. "Island of the Shroud." Danielle studied it through the binoculars. If Oko was right, this place would be the key to finding what they were searching for. A Mayan site that legends referred to as the Mirror, a reference to Tohil, the Mayan god of fire, who wore an obsidian mirror on his forehead. It was a symbol of power and might, and if Danielle, McCarter, and the NRI were correct, a symbol of far more than that. But so far the mirror had remained hidden. To find it, they needed help that supposedly existed on the island of the Shroud. "Are you sure?" she asked. "The statue is there," he insisted. "I saw it once, when I came with the shaman. He told me that the time was coming, the time when all things would change." Danielle scanned the terrain. To reach the lake required a hazardous descent, down a steep embankment of loose and crumbling shale on the caldera's inner cone. It would be rough, but much easier physically than the climb they just completed. She tied her hair into a ponytail to let the breeze cool her neck, then settled her eyes on McCarter. He'd managed a sitting position now, though his chest still heaved and fell. His loose linen shirt was open. The T-shirt he wore underneath was drenched in perspiration. Sweat poured down his face, leaving brackish, salty trails on his dark skin. McCarter was in good shape for a 60-year-old university professor. and they'd brought only small packs and limited supplies, having discarded all else in the name of speed. But 3 days of constant hiking and climbing had taken its toll. "Ready?" she asked. He looked up, clearly in a state of unreadiness. "It's all downhill from here," she promised. "I've been hearing that load of tripe since I turned 40, he said between breaths, "and so far nothing has gotten any easier." He waved her on. "Go, I'll try to catch up." McCarter and Danielle were an unlikely team, but they'd formed a bond 2 years earlier when Danielle had recruited him for an expedition to the Amazon. Things had started well enough, but in the depths of the jungle everything had gone horribly wrong. By the thinnest of margins, the two of them and a very few others had survived. In the aftermath of that mission, Danielle had quit the NRI and McCarter had gone back to New York to teach. At the time, he had seemed far more likely to sue the organization than to ever work for it again. But in answering to his own curiosity, he had agreed to do just that. Despite her reasons not to, Danielle had rejoined as well in hopes of protecting him. The way she figured, she owed him that much. He would never have heard of the NRI if she hadn't recruited him. After 8 months in the field and several close calls, including a car bomb and 2 shootings, she wasn't about to leave him now. Besides, her only chance of returning to Washington, D.C., and the semblance of a normal life she'd been building was to finish this job and deposit McCarter safely back in New York. "We stick together," she said. "Besides, you're the expert here. You're the one who needs to see this. All we have to do is get down there before them, learn what we need to know, and follow the lake out." "And what happens when they catch us?" "They want the statue. They're not going to chase us." She extended a hand, which McCarter eyed suspiciously, before reaching out and grasping. She helped him to his feet, and the 3 of them went over the side, skidding and sliding and running where they could. As they reached the bottom, she could hear shouting far up above. Their pursuers had come to the crest. "Hurry," she said, racing across the last 10 yards of solid ground and diving into the cold mountain lake. When they were halfway across, gunfire began cracking from the ridge. Shots clipped the water around them, and she dove under the surface and kept kicking until she could no longer hold her breath. She came up shrouded in the sulphurous mist. McCarter and Oko surfaced beside her. The gunfire had ceased, but another sound caught her attention. A distant rhythmic thumping reaching out across the mountains. It was the staccato clatter of helicopter blades somewhere to the east. Apparently their enemies had a new trick in store. "Where is it?" she asked Oko. He pointed toward the summit. "At the top," he said, "hidden in the trees." They climbed the steep angle of the island slope, using the trees as handholds. They found the statue at the dead center. A great block of stone with the outline of a man carved into it, a Mayan king in full regalia. In his right hand he carried what looked like a net holding 4 stones. In his left was an orb of some kind. Hieroglyphic writing was scrawled across the bottom, and a great snake twisted across the top, with its large open mouth stretching down as if to devour the king with a single bite. "Ahau Balam," McCarter said, reading the title glyphs. "The Jaguar King, speared guide of the Brotherhood." Oko, who was of Mayan descent, fell silent in awe. McCarter did likewise. Danielle was more concerned with the danger closing in on them. From the sound, she guessed that the helicopter was no more than 3 minutes away, and that the men behind them had to be scrambling down the cliff by now. "We need to get this information and disappear," she said. "What do you see?" McCarter studied the writing, eyes darting here and there. He touched one glyph and then another. He seemed confused. "Professor?" "I'm not sure," he said. The sound of the helicopter lumbered closer, growing into a baritone roar. "We have 2 minutes," she said. "Maybe less." He shook his head in disbelief. "There's no story here, no explanation. It's mostly just numbers." "Dates?" "No, just random numbers." Her mind reeled. She couldn't believe what he was saying. "Maybe if I—" She cut him off. "No time." She pulled out her camera, snapped off a shot, and then checked the screen. The stone was so weathered that the glyphs didn't come out clearly. She took another from a different angle with a similar result. There just wasn't enough definition. The helicopter was closing in. She could hear the men on foot shouting as they came down the Caldera's embankment. "It's not clear enough," she said. McCarter stared at her for a second, and then tore off his shirt, dropped to the base of the statue, and pressed it up against the raised hieroglyphs. Holding it there with one hand, he began rubbing fistfuls of the volcanic soil against the surface of the shirt. Oko helped him. The helicopter thundered by overhead, slowing and turning, looking for a place to land. She thanked the heavens that there wasn't one to be found. She dropped down beside him to help. The shapes of the carving began to emerge, the edges and the details. It looked like a blurry charcoal drawing, but it was working. As they worked, pine needles, leaves, and chaff began to swirl around them. The helicopter was moving in above, its downwash blasting everything about. "That's it," she said. "No more time." McCarter rolled up the shirt and tucked it into his backpack, while Danielle grabbed a large stone and began smashing the surface of the statue. The glyphs of the priceless work crumbled under the blows, shards flying like sparks from a grinding wheel. Suddenly, weighted ropes dropped through the trees, unfurling like snakes. "Run!" she shouted. McCarter and Oko took off. Men clad in midnight blue slid down the ropes, crashing through the trees. Danielle wheeled around, pulling out a Glock 9mm pistol. Before she could fire, two metal prongs hit her in the back, penetrating her shirt. A shock racked her body. She fell forward, unable to move or even shout, crashing hard like a sack of flour and convulsing from the taser. Lying on her side, she saw Oko go over the edge and McCarter running after him, wires from the taser darts trailing after him. He managed to dodge them, then lurched suddenly at the hammering of a submachine gun. A spatter of blood flew, and he went tumbling over the steep embankment. The next moments were a blur. She tried to move, only to have another jolt from the taser rack her body. As she was rolling on the ground, men surrounded her and zip-tied her wrists behind her back. All around, the trees bent and whipped beneath the thunderous symphony of the helicopter's downwash. She glanced up. A dark shape filled a gap in the trees. It was a Sikorsky sky crane, a huge beast, shaped like a hovering claw, with an empty space for a belly where it could secure incredible payloads. Tractor trailers and small tanks could be suspended beneath it. The thing would have no trouble with the stone monument. Heavy chains dropped from the monster and were secured. The whirling blades roared, the chains snapped taut, and the statue was pulled free. The man beside her grabbed a radio from his hip. "We have one of them," he said. He looked toward the rim over which McCarter and Oko had flown. "The local boy got away, but the other one's dead." Danielle's heart fell. The words left her sick. "Take her out past the mist," she heard the guard say. "They're going to drop a basket for her." Danielle was forced to stand and then dragged off. As she was pulled past the spot where McCarter had fallen, her legs nearly gave out. McCarter lay unmoving on his side, 30 feet down the steep slope, wrapped awkwardly around a tree. His back was bent at an impossible angle, and his eyes remained open, staring lifelessly into the distance. His T-shirt was soaked with blood. She hesitated, her legs feeling as if they might give out. A shove in the back sent her moving again. 5 minutes later, she was in the cabin of the giant helicopter, the carved relic secured in the bay, with McCarter, Oko, and the island of the Shroud disappearing far behind her. Chapter 2. Professor McCarter lay unmoving on the black volcanic slope. His eyes were open and fixed, staring forward at the oddly tilted landscape. He tumbled down the slope of the wooded island, slamming the base of his spine against the tree. The backpack had flown out of his hand, disappearing farther down into the mist. McCarter himself had come to rest, looking up the hill, watching as both Danielle and the statue were hauled away. He lay motionless, but not by choice. His body was numb and cold. He couldn't feel his feet or legs or anything below his waist. He could barely feel the tips of his fingers. He could barely breathe. He couldn't have called out for help, even if he'd wanted to. Alone now, fear had begun to grip him. McCarter guessed that he was paralyzed, and to the man up the steep slope from him, it must have looked as if he were dead. He'd been hit in the leg, and though the flow had slowed quite a bit, but Carter had never seen so much blood.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?